Können wir jetzt schon zwei haben, oder? Ja?
Ja, wir sind zwei Moderatoren, wir brauchen mindestens zwei. Ah, drei, okay, das ist noch besser.
Ja. Ja.
So you weren't at the P47 rock bar with the others? You missed it.
So we're just missing out. I will run. If I see her. Yeah. Probably she's in the restaurant. Lucia. Ich gehe noch die Leiter. Okay, thanks to all of you who are already up here. And I kindly invite everybody who is not yet here. We're starting. Can you come as well? I'm getting you. No, you can go up here. You can go upstairs. There's one. Lucia. Oops, sorry, Jan. When you have buildings, I kept having to move. Right? I had to keep moving. I couldn't see. Yeah, exactly. Really, I mean, also. Yeah, it's like Florian. Ich sehe die Personen, die hinter dieser Säule sind, sehe ich nicht. Aber das. Also wenn du sie dann auch nicht siehst.
Welcome everybody. Hello. We're ready to start with the final panel of our conference. So anybody still getting coffee, we ask you to return. And everybody's already here. Welcome back. Welcome to, as I already said, the final panel. I'm very happy to facilitate this panel with my colleague, Alexandra. whom I think you already know from Attac and from the Austrian platform Andershandeln, Trade Differently.
And I'm as happy to facilitate this panel with Lisa Mittendrein, who is from the Chamber of Labor.
Thank you. And in the last 2 days, we've had very, I think, in-depth discussion about these rapid changes that we're currently seeing in the world. We've discussed, analyzed the political, the economic shifts. We have talked about trade policy and different policy initiatives. We have criticized specific trade agreements and already started looking at more in depth and how to develop further our fights against them. We have looked at the intersections of trade with coloniality, with climate, with gender, with many other issues. And here and there, in many of the sessions already, the questions of alternatives popped up. And what I think was really important was that in many of these spaces, people have voiced the understanding that if we talk about alternatives in trade, we can never do that separate from the general alternatives for our economy. That we cannot just change our trading system, we have to change the foundations of the economic system that we live in. And I'm very happy that we have this final panel to focus on the progressive trade agenda in the age of geopolitics and what that might look like. And Alexandra will now introduce our excellent and very large panel.
Exactly. I'm happy to present you the 4 fantastic women that with which we will now have a first conversation here at the panel, and then of course we will enlarge it. And you already have noticed that there is something strange, right? Because here, Lucia Bárcena sits and not Luciana. And because unfortunately Luciana has got sick. She's lying in bed with fever and a cold. So we're very sorry for her, because it's always horrible to get sick when you're on travel in general, but more even when you're on a travel. But nicely, and thank you, Lucia Bárcena, she has accepted to quickly step in for her. Lucia is working with TNI. She's a researcher there, and she's a long-standing activist also on trade and investment policies, and is also still an activist with Ecologistas en Acción. She's based in Madrid, but has also a Mexican background. A global South background, yeah. So thank you, Lucia, for jumping in and stepping in quickly. Next to her is Melinda St. Louis from Public Citizen. She's the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, a US-based consumer organization, and also works for many, many years on trade and investment policies, and we've been working to stop TTIP, among others. Next to Lucia is Penny Clarke. Penny is the Deputy General Secretary of the European Public Services Union, which brings together all the trade unions in Europe that struggle and fight for public services, where many struggles are ongoing these days, as we can read every day. And EPSU has been also a very key actor in the struggles to stop the GATS agreement, but also in TTIP. So very strongly engaged for many, many years in the fight for trade alternatives in that field. And last but not least, Mathilde Dupre. She's the co-director of the Veblen Institute, which is based in Paris, and it's a think tank that works on economic reforms needed for a just and democratic ecological transition. And also with Mathilde, we share a long history of struggling against TTIP, but now also against EU-Mercosur. And it's fantastic to have you all here on the panel. And I hand over back to Lisa, who will introduce the first round.
Thank you. So in the first round, we will check in a little bit what the different perspectives are that we have here on the panel towards the progressive trade agenda, and what that means. And then in the second round, we will go a bit more in depth on concrete proposals. So I will start off with you, Mathilde, and to ask you broadly, like from a European perspective, where do you see the priorities for a progressive trade agenda? And maybe you can also relate it a little bit to the European Green Deal, which we already discussed a lot in this conference, and the possibilities, but also challenges that it provides.
Thank you. and hello to everybody. I'm really happy to be here. It has been a very brilliant discussion since yesterday. I hope that we will rise to the challenge for this last difficult roundtable on the way forward. But yeah, so to start from our perspective, the main elements for a progressive trade agenda should be, of course, no new free trade agreement from the EU perspective, the end of ISDS, the use also of agricultural value chain management instruments, new trade rules which give back regulatory space to states, and greater scope for adopting regulation on processes and production methods at national level. And I think that in the EU context, we should stick to the very ambitious environmental targets that were announced by the European Commission in its Green Deal communication, which were one, climate neutrality by 2050, the other, a growth model decoupled from resource use, and all this with a fair transition, and also a green oath, which is a do not harm general principle, which should guide all the policy discussion. But as you all know, when the Green Deal discussion started, the European Commission launched a review of many of its public policies in the light of those objectives. And on the trade policy, the exercise remained very superficial. So the main two elements were to raise Paris Agreement as an essential component of new trade agreements, and to implement carbon border adjustment mechanism. Then in the latest revision of the Trade and Sustainable Development chapters, they also announced a new approach with stronger enforcement mechanism, but still it is obviously not likely to allow us to respect the initial objective stated by the Green Deal. And in addition, we've seen yesterday that the EU's choices in terms of decarbonation strategy tend to reinforce its aggressiveness with which it is negotiating new trade agreement to secure access to raw materials. So we've still a lot of work to do, but I wanted to highlight some achievements that we've succeeded to get all together as a society in the recent year, because sometimes we don't do that enough, I would say, because we managed to get no new investment treaty ratified since the EU got this competence in the 2009. So this is a big victory I've been told by a French person in charge of those issues that there was no more really great appetite within the EU to keep negotiating those agreements, because they know that it will be very difficult to ratify them, and I'm sure they will try to find a way to do it, but still this is something that we should acknowledge. And we are almost out of the Energy Charter Treaty, and the European Parliament has defined a new approach on investment protection, which is much more restrictive. And also the ratification of several trade agreements has been blocked or delayed at least. So these are already huge achievement given the small resources that we have among civil society to work on those issues. But it's of course not enough, because there remain a huge stock of investment protection treaties within many southern countries in particular. The EU is also constantly negotiating new agreements, as I was saying, or modernizing new ones. And the EU is also consistently inventing new strategies to circumvent the opposition. So we still have to work a lot and to make sure that what we achieve is not only to our benefit, but also to build a new trade regime that works for all.
Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you also for pointing out these victories. is very important. And I think also, like you mentioned from the French example, we can sometimes feel, rather small, also considering the opponents that we have. And it's always really pleasant when we get to talk to officials and who keep complaining about civil society making everything so difficult in trade policy. I think it's very nice. I will pass on to you, Lucia, to ask you also for the broad perspective that you have on a progressive trade agenda from a Global South perspective.
Okay, so thanks for the last minute invitation. Happy to be here. If I would have known, I would have slept a bit more. But good. So I wanted to bring an example of a very recent example that we saw in La Guajira, Colombia. La Guajira in Colombia is the coastal territory in Colombia. It's also home. It's a place where one of the biggest coal mine exists in Latin America. Open, how do you cielo abierto, no? Like those open pit mines. It's the biggest open pit mine in Latin America, and it's also responsible for big producer of Colombian coal. Colombia is one of the main GDP of coal, but La Guajira is also home of the Wayuu community, which is a community of indigenous people of more around 3,000 community, indigenous Wayuu live in La Guajira, next to where the coal mine is. And La Guajira is also a territory that has very little water. It has big socio-ecological pressure because of the activity of the mine, but also because of climate change. They have been suffering a lot in the last years, and they have also been quite abandoned by the state and, by everybody, basically, no? And it's also home of Arroyo Bruno, which is a small stream. It's a river that basically feeds in the big river in the region in La Guajira, which at the same time gives access to water, to the little water that the community has to build, to have their agriculture, to basically subsist, no? And this river is currently being threatened by the activity of the coal mine, which is constantly expanding its limits to what it can actually produce, no? So the Wayuu, together with a collective of lawyers in Colombia, they brought a case to the Constitutional Court in Colombia, saying that what the mine was doing was basically, violating the human rights, the right to water, the right to live, basically. So they won this case in the Constitutional Court in Colombia, 2 years ago, more or less. But the court hasn't yet executed the sentence, the lawsuit, which already shows the power that these companies have, especially in countries like in Latin America and especially in Colombia, where there have been huge concessions in the past to these companies. So the mining company is not only not complying with the lawsuit, but it actually also initiated an ISDS case against Colombia, saying that because of this Constitutional Court, what it said, the lawsuit, it cannot continue its activity, and so it's losing profits. Glencore, it's the mining company from Switzerland, is not only filing one case against Colombia, but it actually has 5 cases against Colombia for the same reasons, no? So how did we get here, no? How is this happening? So on the one side, as I said, we have the government of Colombia, which has been until now a liberal government, giving huge concessions to these mining companies and extractivist companies. And on the other side, we have the same governments signing off bilateral investment treaties. Other things as well, but to our topic, this is what's important, no? This all contributing to this idea of emptying democracy, no? When private and public actors, they get together, trade off all of the privatize the water, they privatize the land, they give this big mining, all the concessions, basically pushing away the territories and the people as political subjects. They're abandoned. They are no more considered political subjects in all of this international law and everything that's going on, no? But of course, the Wayuu, they're not the only one, no? People every day, everywhere are putting their bodies to fight against corporate abuse. especially in Africa, in Latin American countries, no? And this is not new, this has been happening for a long time, no? So what's the idea that I want to bring here, no? That seeing all of this like injustice, not only at the international law, but also at the national level, with this idea of the territories and the people having been pushed away, like not considered as subjects anymore, like illegitimate as a state, we need to build an alternative vision of law and justice. So one that's basically built from, like the counterpower built from below. So again, putting the people and the territories as the primary political subjects from where laws and norms originate, and not from, you know, the above, the elites. Like if we go again and think like, where does all of this like international law and ISDS, who invented this? No, it's basically like a few bunch of lawyers, white male, that sat down and had like this great idea on how to create a system that, you know, would just be legitimized by international law and would exist, and it would bring actually all of us to discuss about the clause. No, we have to change this, and we have to see how to find the, you know, the way to avoid the system, while forgetting that, you know, at the origin of everything, it's just like an unfair and an unjust system that's unprotecting territories and people who are already the most abandoned, no? So, you know, go back to this idea of like, where do we have to put the focus on, and where do we have to think that law and norms have to originate, no? But unfortunately, as we see now, no, like while the international law, investment protection law, has been sophisticated throughout the years, at the same time, human rights international law has been emptied in content, no? There's like we have binding contracts, we have mechanisms to enforce, we have so many things from the international law side, and from the human rights, it's, you know, still like we're fighting and struggling to have a UN binding treaty that, you know, could be used to bring justice to the communities, and it's such a hard job, and we're there since like 10 years, no, trying to struggle just for a little bit of justice for the communities, no? So I guess like we have become all very smart on ISDS. We are very smart on the different like investment protection standards and clauses, but we can't forget that why we do this is to protect the territories, is to protect the Wayuu communities, is to allow them to live their lives with water and as they want to live their lives. So we can't separate investment law from human rights. And yeah, I guess that's the, you know, the idea that I want to bring here. Like, we do this because we want to protect the territories. I mean, we can use the argument of you government don't want to be sued, but we want to protect the territories. So, you know, just remember and going back to why are we looking at all of this in the first place. So I want to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for raising this really important point. I think in the depth of the analysis and these technocratic, you know, modes of government, you can sometimes get lost. And I think it's really important how you reminded us to center, you know, the subjectivity and the question of the people and the territories in the center. So thanks for that. I will pass on to Melinda to ask you to tell us a little bit from the perspective of movements, social movements, civil society in North America and the US specifically, where your focus for a progressive trade agenda lies.
Great, thank you. And I also want to just thank the organizers for this really fruitful couple of days. And I think that it's been very thought-provoking, and we've noted multiple times that it's a confusing time, I think, and the path is on a number of issues is unclear, you know, given all the multiple crises that we face. So I also wanted to start with some reflection on the collective power that we've had in the United States and with cross-border solidarity with many of you, because I do think that we can and should claim a fair amount of credit for some of the really remarkable shifts in the conventional thinking that we currently have in trade policy, particularly in the US. I mean, I think if you had told me 8 years ago when we were during the Obama years and we were fighting the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, that now the U.S. government would no longer be seeking investor-state dispute settlement in free trade agreements, or the intellectual property provisions or the intellectual property chapter in free trade agreements. I wouldn't have believed it. Like, it seemed really impossible at that point. Or that independent Mexican unions would have been able to use the enforcement mechanism that was included in the most recently negotiated USMCA agreement to be able to actually get fair collective bargaining agreements in some of these factories. I mean, that also seemed really impossible given how weak the labor standards have been in free trade agreements. And so, I think, and the reason that seemed impossible is because, Democrats and Republicans, didn't matter who was in the White House, they were pushing the same corporate-dominated trade. And every time we would, talk to the U.S. trade representative, it was basically a revolving door with corporations. And I mean, the U.S. was the biggest demandeur of all of these policies. So, I think, of course, it was the excesses and failures of the model that really led to a lot of the political backlash, and the fact that populists from the left and the right, unfortunately, were also able to exploit that strong backlash. But I also, strongly believe that the broad coalition of labor, environmental, consumer, family farm groups, faith and community organizations that were campaigning and raising concerns about these problematic rules for decades really played an important role in kind of shifting the political context. Just to mention, obviously altogether we stopped the expansion of the World Trade Organization back in Seattle, and there's the Seattle to Brussels movement that came out of that. And the U.S. stopped the expansion of the free trade area of the Americas in the early 2000s. We managed, and then with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, was negotiated by the Obama administration, but it could not receive majority support in Congress because of the extreme corporate rules. And then, of course, that was also exploited by President Trump, by Donald Trump to kind of throw that in the face of the Democrats. And so I think that political shift, President Biden, who he previously supported NAFTA, he supported TPP, he was, the vice president during that time, but he really responded. Like, he has heard the political message and is calling for, this worker-centered trade that we've been hearing about. And for the first 2 years, we weren't sure what that was going to look like. Now there's this flurry of free trade adjacent initiatives, but they're insisting they're not traditional free trade agreements. So there's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is with 13 countries in the Asia-Pacific. They've reinitiated discussions with Kenya, a strategic trade and investment partnership, which is kind of reinvigorating a free trade agreement negotiation that started during the Trump administration. And they've announced also an America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP. We have many new acronyms that we have to deal with in the U.S. So I think, so first, I do think it's important for us to recognize, the enormous blow to the corporate trade status quo that we have achieved, not just in the United States, but with all of you in doing that. But, and the fact that they are not only just saying that, but to not be pursuing ISDS, to not be pursuing IP chapters, to not be pursuing procurement, to not be pursuing traditional market access is getting them a lot of heat from the Chamber of Commerce, from a lot of elites, and they've been willing to withstand that so far, which is kind of amazing, I think. But obviously, our role continues to be as civil society to be pushing. Yeah. So so I'll just say that we're concerned that the trade negotiating process is still very secretive, and that there's a trade advisory system with 500 corporate advisors who have access to the text. So we're pushing very hard on that. We are particularly concerned that big tech companies are using this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in particular to push an agenda, a deregulatory agenda. So that's something that we're following really closely, and I will end here to say that and I had also mentioned, and we have also talked about these critical minerals agreements that I think we need to be watching very closely. So we are insisting on more transparency in the trade negotiations. I think building relationships with affected communities in the Global South is absolutely critical. Solidifying the wins around ISDS and that we have achieved, building on the improvements of labor standards in the USMCA, the fighting big tech companies' attempts to insert this agenda, and trying to ensure that this rush for supply chains and critical minerals, we don't contribute once again to this extractivist model that exploits vulnerable communities. So, and pushing hard to ensure that our climate and worker empowerment goals are enhanced, not undermined by this kind of new generation of so-called non-trade agreements and so forth. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Melinda, also for, again, also like claiming credit for some of the changes and the shifts and the victories, because I think, you know, like social struggles have such a central role in pushing forward history and in affecting political and economic changes, but then very often we get written out of these histories, you know, and I think it's so important to claim also this role, ambivalent as is sometimes maybe. And then I will ask you, Penny, if you could also share with us the perspective, the general perspective that you have from a workers' and trade union point of view on the progressive trade agenda.
Thank you, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. As was said, Public Services Union, so maybe just to mention our sectors, in particular the health and social care, utilities, so including water, waste, energy, and government in a way, so every level of government from local to regional to national, and even in the EU institutions we have some members in EPSU, and of course we link to the Public Services International at global level, so we have members in all the different continents, but of course we're more specific on Europe, but in a big Europe, not just the European Union, we have members also right to the Chinese border in effect, and that means we have a perspective which is hopefully worker-centered, yes, as was said. I think it's a good place to start, but worker in the sense that workers are also interested in things which are not just goods and services on markets, no, that we care economy, we've talked a bit about this the last couple of days. We've talked a bit about needs, you know, a needs-based economy, not focusing so much on aspirations. I listened to something that Ambassador Tai said recently, where she repeated this race to the top. I am not sure that we want a race to the top anymore, to be frank. And I think a lot of workers realize that the trickle-down economics and the trickle-down trade policy and the extractive model and all the other things that colleagues have just said here about the ISDS, about the regulatory cooperation, about the secrecy in trade agreements, does not actually benefit workers in the sense it's not leading us to a more fair and equal and just society. I agree very much that we have managed to take the sting out of a lot of the recent attempts to reinforce. Well, we've been talking a lot about geopolitics and neoliberalism. I think it's quite handy to keep both. So I think we've taken the sting out some of the more recent ones. And here I would say we should claim our successes on the process. I mean, I recognize colleagues here that we've been working with on EU-Canada, on ISDS. In Vienna is actually a core city for EPSU because we have done several events with you, but also with the Arbeitskammer, with the OGB, the Austrian Confederation. We did a joint meeting here with the Education International as well. So, you know, Austria with the civil society mix, a bit like Belgium, where I am based, I think are really good countries that show that there's a connection between different organizations, and I would say always from a EPSU perspective and a PSI perspective, keeping the social and the environmental together as much as we can, because we think these principles of social and ecological justice are linked, and that perhaps if I would have one kind of main point at this round would be to emphasize the quality dimension of everything. You know, we often hear people say climate crisis is for us. Well, actually, no, it's not. No, it's the top 5%, 1% that are more responsible for the climate problems. They consume too much. They're not only in the north, wherever that is. We also have a lot of consumption in other parts of the world. We have a lot of billionaires in all parts, all our regions. We have a lot of billionaires. And so things like, not directly linked to trade, but we can, like tax justice, but we can see that the trade agenda kind of reinforces this inability to move towards more equality between people, between genders, between regions, between just on the equality. So I think that's something, and equality in also including poverty. You know, that this should be a central focus of trade. How do we deal with that? And I conclude by just saying we've also discussed the bit about state responsibilities and company responsibilities, and of course they go together, but the governments, in a way, also through trade, but also for other things, create legal frameworks which clearly enable companies to circumvent all kinds of things, and this is a problem. So we need to reclaim, this is where we had also in the last panel, we need to reclaim the rule of law to try and assert, you know, the primacy of general interest in the discussion. And that, I think, would give us a handle to tackle the next steps on more fair and progressive trade, and trade as a means to support dealing with the different problems we have on the environment, on justice, and taking a worker perspective, that as a worker we're also a citizen, and that we work in our homes, outside our homes, we work in different continents. We are obviously within all the economic production processes and the consumption processes. You know, without workers and anybody else consuming, there is nothing to trade. No, we would not have any production process if we couldn't buy anything, and that indeed not everything has to be traded for money, and that will be for the next session. Panel.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Penny.
I take over now for the second round. I think it was very interesting and important, first of all, that you highlighted our successes. I think that's very important, that we also see what we have achieved, and at the same time you already outlined several strategic angles that I could hear, like continuing to fight the bad, the expansion of this agenda that still is going on, the question of legal strategies and reclaiming the rule of law, look into enforcement mechanisms that are really hands-on and not complicated, like in the case of the US, the democratization of the trade policy, process making, and also to think in a more strategic, coherent way of what is happening in terms of the green agenda, the decarbonization agenda. And we have been also discussing these days how on the one hand this decarbonization agenda in the global north, how it is impacting and creating a series of terrible new trends in the global south, and at the same time we have been also discussing and seeing how changes for transforming our economies are blocked by the existing trade rules. So in the second round we wanted to dig a little bit into some ideas that you would chip in of how could we move forward to move in that direction of transforming our economies towards sustainable economies where the vision is living well within planetary limits, and to take in the global south, global north dimension, so a good life for all. So what are sort of like what are elements that we are perhaps already engaging in and struggling, or what are thoughts that you would like to put in? And I wanted to start again with you, Lucia, and perhaps you can take the mic from over there. So what are some ideas that you want to chip in terms of the People's Treaty, for instance?
Yeah. So like the first thing that I was bringing, was this whole idea of this whole asymmetries of powers that exist from big international investment protection and local communities. So this idea of building counterpower from below, norms and rules that have to originate from the people and the communities became this idea of the International Treaty of Peoples to control the transnational corporations. I don't know if anybody has heard of it, but it was, well, it was an idea that originated, to how can we put an end to these asymmetries? And it's not enough to do it in the corporate social responsibility. We know that we have moved from the great speech that Allende gave in the UN asking for finally some kind of binding regulations that could put an end to human rights violations by corporations. That was a great speech, but it didn't really come into anything. And this whole ideas about social responsibility, ethical codes that corporations should have started to become like the goal, like what everybody was doing. And we all know that, of course, that was never enough. It was always like based on recommendations, based on voluntarism by the corporations. Sometimes even their own corporations did their own ethical codes, like how they should behave, and there was no way of enforcing that or of controlling that. Well, it was basically just ceding to the interest of the corporations that did not want any type of interference to their activities, But with this idea of the international treaty, again, we picked up with a lot of organizations, how can we build an international treaty? Well, at the UN level, well, an international treaty that, will be like multilateralism. And how can we actually give it, the enforceability that it needs to avoid transnational corporations to continue abusing human rights? And why is it important to do this at the international level? Because we're talking about transnational corporations, no? It's not like you cannot control a corporation that is based anywhere because they just move around in this what we call the architecture of impunity, and they find ways to avoid law, basically, no? So the only way to avoid this was to create an international treaty that was at the same level, that could, basically follow the transnational corporations in the home, but also in the different levels that it would create, like their phantom companies or whatever system they invent, no, to avoid the law. So then this is where they came this idea of the international treaty. This started to evolute, to evolutionate, evolve, thank you, to the UN binding treaty on human rights and corporations. What was it called? Well, anyway, human rights and corporations. And it started in 2015, 2016. And what was good about this was that finally we could all grasp the idea that it's not sufficient to have voluntary guidelines, but it actually needs some kind of binding. It needs some teeth. We need to provide teeth to these instruments to control the corporations. And we've been since then struggling a lot to actually pass this treaty and to maintain the essence of the treaty, which is all of this, no? It has not been easy. There has been a lot of challenges, especially by the USA, and the European Union has also been very ambiguous in its positions on what to do about this treaty. And now, we already have a draft, and it's going to be, well, we're going to be like revising the draft now in October in Geneva. But yeah, I am a bit critical of where we came, like since the beginning of this whole idea of the International Treaty of People and what we have now. We have to see how the text actually results. But yeah, there are a few like maybe basic principles that should be kept in the treaty that are not necessarily there. And then there's an additional problem that the EU just recently, published a directive on due diligence, which is this other whole idea about we listen to you, we need binding regulations, maybe we don't do it in the international binding treaty, but we propose due diligence directive, so for all the countries in the EU to adopt. No? But what's the problem with the due diligence? It's good on the one side because we recognize the need to have binding instrument, but on the other side, it again gives it to the corporations to do their own due diligence process. So it's telling the corporations, you have to write down what you are going to do in order to avoid any type of harming activity to the environment, etc. But it's you, corporation, drafting that and controlling that it's going to happen. So we don't really know yet what the control mechanism is going to be of that. It's also just like the sanction that is embedded in this idea of due diligence is basically monetary. So it's kind of like putting a fine to the corporations, which we know that we're talking about huge transnational corporations that have a lot of money, and a small fine is not going to prevent them from continuing their activities. And the due diligence also doesn't give the possibility of communities to actually access justice. So, to find reparation, what is going to happen with the activity that the corporation actually did, no? So there are a lot of there are a lot of gaps in the due diligence proposal, and the fear is that this is going to become this is going to become the goal, no? Like what other countries are going to start adopting and abandon this idea that we initially had about the UN binding treaty. So this is one of the risks that we are seeing of what we can go through, and we definitely have to be aware, and we cannot, allow that to happen in the sense like we can have a due diligence, but we cannot forget that we still need a legal framework that is beyond, no? That it goes more and broader, that it's not only like this small piece of instrument. And I wanted to say also that I didn't say before that while being in Colombia, we did recognize that all of the successes that we've been having like all over the world, in the US, in Europe, they are aware of that too. And it's also this reading of like, we know that the European Union is actually challenging ISDS. We know that the US has actually eliminated ISDS from its treaty, although some maintaining it with Mexico in some cases, no? So why should we in Colombia not be included in that debate, no? But at the same time, we still see the EU, when we discuss these things, saying, well, it's different when we talk about EU than we talk about Colombia, because in Colombia, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we can rely on their courts or we can rely on their system. So again, like this colonial discourse of let's apply that to us, but not necessarily to other countries, no? So again, it's great that we made all these victories, but how do we now use that to continue destroying the system, basically?
Thank you, Lucia. And I think it was a very important insight into this approach about the People's Treaty and how difficult it is to move forward, and also the things that come along with how it's getting diluted and how the power relations are out there. And so I think that's also something for us to always keep in mind when engaging in these struggles and to be aware of. I want to move to Mathilde and ask you to perhaps feed in one idea that has been emerging as one element, because I think also there will not be this one big thing, one single strategy that will help us to destroy the system and move into and all of a sudden from one day to the other have the new system. I think it is these small elements that will, and victories that will keep destroying it and move us there. And in France, you have been developing one approach that is called the mirror clause, mirror measures, as one element, and I think it would be interesting to get some insight what the idea behind that is and how this could help to move us into a more progressive trade agenda that is helping us to also advance the socio-ecological transformation that we need.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, in France, one of the issues that has been highlighted by all the work done by civil society, but also consumer organization, farmers organization, and even experts that were commissioned by the French government, was the divergence in health and in environmental regulation between imported products and European product in the agriculture. And well, for instance, this commission on CETA and Mercosur highlighted that the fact that there is the case of the use of highly hazardous pesticides that are not some of them forbidden in the EU and still used for imported product. Also the use of antibiotics as growth promoter in livestock farming. And those antibiotics have been banned in the EU in order to prevent antibiotic resistance at international level. So why is this topic important and strategic, I think? Well, historically, the trade rules were drawn up in such a way that production processes and methods, the so-called PPM, were the exclusive concern of the producer country. And the consumer country could only lay down rules on the final characteristic of the product. So, for example, on pesticide residue to protect the health of the consumer, but not on the use of pesticides that were dangerous for the health of producers or for the health of local communities or the health of the ecosystems. And why we are debating this now? Well, as long as trade barriers remain relatively high for some of these agricultural products, these divergence mattered little. And now, with the latest agreement in the pipeline, this is generating more and more political and public debates. And also because trade competition is more and more often used in the EU as an argument not to straighten the current rules. And we can see that with the farm to fork strategy, for instance, in the EU, in which one of the objectives was to halve pesticide use by 2030. And it is very difficult to implement because many of the actors are using the international competition as an obstacle to do that. And well, to put it in another way, this historical approach seems now quite obsolete in the face of the climate crisis, the collapse of biodiversity, and the global health concerns. And it seems difficult to justify to European consumers, to producers that we are banning certain practices in the EU because they are too dangerous for the environment or the producer's health, and we turn a blind eye to the impact, these same impact when they occur in third countries. Well, this has been already taken as a concern not only at the French level. The European Parliament, for instance, adopted a quite broad amendment in the review of the Common Agricultural Policy in late 2020. And it's where the idea of minor measure comes from. So maybe just to point, there's a difference between minor measures that are unilateral measures implemented by the EU that apply to all imported products from any origin of production, and minor clauses that would be only conditionality in trade agreements where we give market access in exchange of the respect of certain sustainability criteria. And of course, we are more in favor of minor measures that are much powerful than minor clauses that could be used to legitimate some free trade agreements. But yeah, this is something that is now more and more discussed. There's been one rule on antibiotic in 2018 in the EU, but it's still not applied. There's another, well, on the imported deforestation that can be seen as a minor measure. Also another new ones from this year on the ban of pesticide residues for 2 neonicotinoids. And well, I guess that this is quite a major paradigm shift that can accelerate international discussion on more ambitious and binding standards on this area. Many opponents are raising the issue of compatibility with the WTO rules, and well, we try to advocate that this is not the case, and even if it was the case, it should be an argument to change the rules. But more importantly, there is the question of fairness. And of course, if we put more constraint on the producer's country, this has to come with more support to see how these producers can respect the rules. And we can see all this discussion on the imported deforestation, for instance, on specific production such as cocoa, where the deforestation comes more from poverty related issue than big corporation deforesting. So here there are very important answers that has to be developed for this standard to be met. And the last question I wanted to raise is the question of coherence, because it's not a question of saying that the EU does everything better than the rest of the world, because, for instance, on pesticides, we have a lot of national derogation that should be ended, and also because we are exporting still a lot of banned pesticide that we are not allowed to use anymore in the EU, but we are still producing them and exporting them in third countries. And this is something we are also working on quite strongly. So we succeeded to get an export ban in France, which remains partial. But this same week, there was another export ban in Belgium. Another one is discussed in Germany, and we are expecting to see a proposal from the European Commission for EU rule by the end of the year. So I think this is something really also really challenging for our own practices. And I'm sure that beyond pesticides, there are other types of exports that should be stopped, such as in the waste sector, for instance, and other things we don't know yet about and we would love to work on.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that insight, and I think that's also a very good example of where we have also successful struggles within Europe, where it's also about linking these struggles within Europe, where people fight righteously for against pesticides, for instance, with this international dimension, and not just say the world ends at the border. Penny, I want to move on to you and ask you to give us some insights also in relation to these many struggles that we see now in Europe for improving the whole working conditions in the area of public services, and how that could be linked, or what is the thinking in relation to how to advance a progressive trade agenda. And perhaps you can also pick up on this example that now I've forgotten the name, of course, that you exposed the other day, because I thought that was very interesting what our colleagues in the US managed to get into the revised version of NAFTA, so the US-Mexican-Canadian agreement, where it is now possible. Sandra said it, now I have the name. Sandra explained how there is now a very simple measure that workers can use, where they don't have to go to institutions and through legal, long-term legal fights, but it is something very quick. And I thought that was a very interesting approach that strengthens workers and really makes a difference. So, yeah, please give us your insight and reflections on that.
Maybe to start on that last point, well, just very quickly to say that obviously it's a good step forward, and we are very interested to see how it's going to work out and develop. And of course, it's for everybody to use and to build on, whichever, whatever stage of development, whatever country. I think these quicker processes are certainly to be picked up. I'm actually going to evade your question, that second bit, actually, because what I want to talk about with you is public services, and I'm not going to let you off the hook. So Friday was Public Services Day, 23rd of June, UN Day. I think that's also interesting. The UN, our multilateral UN system, for all its faults, something to also revisit and to re-strengthen. and certainly to give more weight in this aspect of the rule of law and the rule of the universal and public interest law. But the public services angle is because we see that in this time of the crisis that we're seeing, that, you know, universal access to affordable public services, public goods, however you want to call it, collective goods, is one of the keys. And it is related to trade, because trade, we started working on trade very much because we see that it picks, you know, it's another thing that picks away at it, because a lot of the things which I said, affordable access, universal, equal treatment, these are not market values. No, this has nothing to do with markets. And if you want to have universal access to good quality public services, or good quality, you have to either have it public, yeah, then you're out of the market. There is also a lot of room to talk about that. We know we've had a tax on public ownership. The example of the South African mines was a good one in the panel, just to make the point that the reform agenda put to the South African mine workers, or the one they were discussing, was basically to privatize or liberalize, or, you know, but there was not a real reform agenda to actually improve it. And there are still a lot of people out there that think, you know, if the public company, whatever, is not so good, then yes, indeed, liberalize it or privatize it. But there's one thing that history shows, is that if it's not good when it's public, it is even worse when you privatize it. You cannot get around the need to reform things to work in the general interest by putting it in private hands. If you keep things out of the market, clearly you limit some of the risks that we see that the market is creating. No? The energy sector, where we in EPSU, we struggled quite a lot against energy liberalization, because we knew it was going to go in the wrong direction, and that we wouldn't have, you know, more accessible, cheaper, more sustainable energy. We knew it, and many others knew it. We see now that, of course, you can't just, you know, click your fingers and change the time back, but you can work to mitigate the damage and to get more public control, I would say, not necessarily ownership of all the aspects. You know, some of it may be a little bit difficult. Start with the easier thing. I think we should have more of a discussion about the things that we ban. You know, we could ban a lot of things which would help. This sort of externalization of the risks, you know, which we see in public services. You see a lot of people, a lot of private actors want to come in, and I would say we represent in EPSU also workers in private companies who are delivering public services, because they're still very dependent on public money to deliver the service in any kind of accessible and universal way. It's very difficult to control. It's very difficult. Things that people were saying, like the treaty on the multinationals. I mean, there's a great American book called Break 'em Up. Maybe Melinda has heard of it. You know, it's in a market rule system, you cannot talk about size. Also in the internal market, you cannot say, you know, a company is too big. You know, the Commission will say, you know, this is not a criteria to limit the size. But clearly, very big private actors are a problem. I mean, and the same people that don't want to regulate this have no trouble to saying very big governments are a problem, no thinking about China. So, you know, bringing things down to size, territorializing them, remunicipalizing them, bringing them back closer to us, especially when they're things like old people's homes, no, which have been, in the commitments and some trade agreements, have been liberalized. So bringing it back, I think, is important. But Public Services Day, as I said, is a way to reclaim the public services. And I heard a lot of people mention public services in this last couple of days in different ways, and they are changing. So I end this bit by just saying, you know, if we look at the different public services from a rights perspective, yeah, the right to, yeah, what do we need? And we've said it in the different panels, the right to basic shelter, to food, to security, to culture, I would actually add, but that's a private one, you know, to well-being. Actually, it's not a private one. Culture is absolutely essential. Art, you know, goodness sake. So every stage of development. And public services, whatever the stage of development, can help. That is not that the markets, again, think you have the economic first, and then you might get the social and perhaps the environmental, but we can't afford that until we have the economic. And often it's played one against the other, but it's really not true. Whatever the level of development, you can build up these public, cooperative, municipal, whatever you want to call them, where you share the benefits of the development. That's the point, sharing. And we have seen, unfortunately, lots of very horrible things happening with public investment and private investment going into countries at less stage of development and actually privatizing and funding private education, private health for the few. And this is really not what we want anywhere, I think. We want to not distort development by, we in countries that are lucky to have good public services, and there still are many, which is why, Alexandra, you were saying that there's some fights, because we don't want to go back to austerity. We don't want to liberalize public services anymore. We want to rebuild them. We want to strengthen them. We want to make sure that they work better in people's interests, and we know that they won't if they go more into private hands. And if we get more austerity now, also maybe in the US coming up, we know that there's, people out there, sharks out there, that see this as a business opportunity, because we do have demographic aging. We know that people are sitting on quite a lot of wealth. We know that there will be companies out there that want to go in there, but they're not going in there to have affordable and accessible care for everyone. They're going in to extract what they can. And Orpea, you will know in France, a really good case. That's a big old people's home, a big example of how you have difficulty to end this extractive model anywhere, but especially in public service when people are dependent on the services. So that's right to water, indeed, defend water, but also have this right to human water. I think right to education, right to health, right to public transport. These are the things that we need to work together.
Yeah. Thank you, Penny. And you didn't evade my question, because I had put the public services question out. And I think it's very important that we see the struggles to remunicipalize, for public control and cooperatives, building cooperatives or taking things back as a key struggle also for progressive trade agenda. We'll now have a very short insight to finish off this round, and then have you come in with Melinda. We had all this talk about these industrial policies that are now have been set up, and with this difficulty that they immediately or very quickly also are confronted with the trade regime, and where other governments say, well, but this is not in line with WTO rules. And in the US, you have come up with some idea of what could be an approach to sort of like avoid that. And I would like you to briefly explain to us this idea of the climate peace clause as an element of how to move forward.
Sure. So I will be short so that there's some time for discussion. This is actually a pretty simple idea, and it's not the radical transformation that we all need, but I think it's an important first step, which is when we think about our climate, the fact that the United States now and the European Union and other governments around the world are trying to take seriously our climate obligations and meeting Paris climate commitments. It's no surprise to any of us that those direct government interventions in the economies that we're going to need to require this transformation is going to bump up against the outdated trade rules that were written in the 1990s with extreme influence by fossil fuel corporations, and that the entire logic of the WTO regime and free trade agreements was actually to make it so that developing countries couldn't implement industrial policies in the ways that we now see are absolutely necessary to achieve the clean energy transformation. So the idea is that we should require or demand of our governments, particularly developed country governments that engaged in the most greenhouse gas emissions, to commit to refrain from using trade rules to challenge other countries' climate and jobs policies as they implement them. So that's the idea of the climate peace clause. So obviously, the problem is even worse under ISDS, because a private corporation can also challenge, these climate and jobs policies, domestic content requirements that are needed to get the political support necessary to pass these policies, like in the United States and other places, performance requirements, all of these things can be seen as discriminatory toward foreign corporations, and therefore they can launch these state-to-state dispute settlements. So we are pushing hard for demanding that the Biden administration, and as we should implement the Inflation Reduction Act, even with the pushback from the European Union and from Japan and others. They should implement it because it was the climate legislation that we needed. It was far from what we needed completely, but it was what we were able to get. We need to implement that, and we need to make the commitment that we will not challenge other countries' climate policies, and particularly in the global South. And so that's the idea of the Climate Peace Clause. We are not envisioning this initially at the WTO because that has its own inequities, but to actually have pledges from developed countries. It could be included in the US-EU relationship. It could be included in G7, G20, other types other types of trade agreements. And then along with that, the absolute demand to eliminate ISDS from all existing free trade agreements. And we have a movement going in the United States to push the Biden administration to go beyond the commitment to not include it in future trade agreements, but to address all of the trade agreements from the past that are being abused and used to challenge affected communities that are fighting extractive industries in around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Melinda. And thanks to everybody on the panel for sharing your perspectives. We will now have a short moment for you in the audience to reflect on what you've heard now on the panel, but also in the whole conference. We'd ask you to gather, just turn around to your neighbor, maybe to groups of 2s and 3s, and just have a couple of minutes of discussion on which examples, approaches, proposals for new progressive trade agenda you find most relevant and most inspiring. And then we will hear your contributions and come back to the panel. So just take a few minutes and then we'll proceed.
Now it's 10 to 1.
And it should finish at?
1 or perhaps 5 minutes.
So, honestly, there's no time.
Okay. Okay.
No, because we already talked.
So, okay, but then. Okay, it's fantastic to see that there is a lot of things that you're discussing, and because we want to finish more or less in time, perhaps with maximum 5 minutes delay or later, we now wanted to just, invite you and here is what else would you want to put into this debate about what progressive trade, what's the title? What progressive trade agenda for the age of geopolitics. We'll hear and add on. If there's a question coming, then our colleagues will still answer, but we'll not have sort of like a concluding round here, given the time, and we want to give more the space here. So I've here. I'll start with, here in the very back. And try to be short so that that ideally all can say something. Please.
Hi, I'm Pooja and I study here in Vienna, and I had a very quick question because we were just discussing now in our discussion session that what role does consumption play in this progressive trade agenda? Because we have spoken about the production side and ensuring that it's ethical and there are legal avenues for it. But you can't really, as we were discussing, you can't really have sustainable mining to some extent if there is going to be excessive consumption of electric cars. And just that's, and you mentioned, Penny mentioned public services, and like there will be a need to common a lot of resources. But I would just, if you guys have any thoughts, if anyone else has some thoughts on this, it would be interesting to hear that. Yeah.
Thanks for putting that up. Flavia, Fiona. I don't know. I always end up with. Sorry.
Something after.
Fiona.
Well, depends. Yes, I try to be short because I had many thoughts this morning when coming here, and we also just discussed a small part of it right now. So thoughts connecting on several things I heard in the last few days. And so, for example, yesterday Niels made that intervention on how we can mobilize, the masses on the streets on trade issues. And Bettina said, well, it's so abstract, it's difficult it's more difficult than on other topics. And then also sometimes, the framing of what is really important can be different in the global north and in the global south. So it's quite complex. And so now I would like to make a maybe bold proposal on progressive trade politics. So maybe I have a story for you, which can be used for mobilization, which is tangible and which could possibly mobilize movements, social movements in the global north and south, very important, as also Melinda pointed out. And so there is this African Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara, who is a central figure in the story that I will very, very shortly present. And besides being super progressive on feminist, ecological, class politics, and many different levels, he focused on food sovereignty. And he said, we have to look at our plates. The imperialism is in our plates, this imported rice, and so on. So that's where we have to start. And I think that Thomas Sankara has an impressive potential for mobilization on the African continent until today. And I also think that it can be very well linked to debates which we have here in the global north. So for example, Luciana talked about crazy trade, so this piers going from Latin America, Asia, back to North America. So it could be linked also with climate activists and also with feminist activists. So we had this intervention on feminist ontologies, and that maybe we should center back to reproductive work, and then food is part of it, but it's also reproduction and production at the same time, right? So I think that could be a common ground for progressive policies, which can include these different perspectives with food sovereignty, which would need to become a principle of multilateral trading rules. And then we can discuss how exactly, at which different forum, And Goose also had a very interesting intervention on food sovereignty and very concrete policy proposals. So it would be great to have time to discuss some concrete policy proposals. Can I still have 2 sentences? One. Okay, one.
No, it's just to be fair, because there's still a few other people that want to say something.
Okay, only one.
And then it's,
Okay, I will break it down. In case, because here are super interesting organizations, if anyone is interested. Actually, I have a plan for a collaborative activist project on top of my PhD, which will be a film, a political interventionist film on Thomas Sankara. I already have a partner, a Cameroonian filmmaker, Berlin-based, who wants to work with me on that. And if anyone wants to join, we already are in touch with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar, in Senegal, who are interested. Yeah, just let me know.
Thanks, and it's probably good if you're not yet connected with the groups in either Germany or Austria that work on trade policy campaigns to get connected so that we can follow up. That would be great. Who's very short?
Yes, thanks. On food sovereignty, so now how can we arrange this? We talked about outside. Can we do it in the GATT rules? I think we agree that the current WTO rules have to move. Is it possible to do it inside WTO and move back to the GATT, or do we need another UN organization and start from scratch? But at least when the GATT rules will be followed, we could reach food sovereignty, because agriculture was not in WTO before, in the GATT.
Yeah, thank you. I want to move to this side, Fabian, and then Lisa. How many people do we take? Because all of them, but huh? 2, 3 more. Okay. 2, 3 more, because also Penny has to leave at 15:15. Fabian.
Okay, I tried to be really quick and wanted to pick up on the point about consumption that was mentioned before. So it seems that the question around enforceability of sustainability chapters and what that means, and if that's some kind of imperialism or imposition, is going to become bigger in the future and more of a point of contention and a difficult position for some of the organizations that have supported this move. And so the question was, in a way, it's a bit bizarre that sustainability chapters would be used against countries that in their consumption and production on the whole are much more sustainable than Europe, whereas we overconsume and use way too many resources and then would use sustainability chapters to punish countries elsewhere. So to turn that debate on its head and push for a reframing of these chapters that looks at the real ecological costs of our current economies, so that they actually more as a discursive strategy to kind of reframe that debate in a way that looks at the real ecological damage and other damage could be a way to avoid that trap. And then we also had a short discussion on thinking about the NAFTA model as a way to bring together civil society actors across borders that have challenges, maybe accessing their own governments, that could be an interesting way to forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Christian?
Thanks. Christian Felber, Economy for the Common Good. Two brief proposals letting greater visions apart. The first one is the Binding Treaty campaign. I see a double opportunity to link it to a debate which has not started yet, which is a debate on global sustainability reporting standards. Currently in the European Union, there is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, kind of finalized, and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards are developed. They are quite flawed, they will not be very effective, and there is a lot of room for improvement, and this could happen on the global scale. And there is a huge opportunity for global civil society to set these standards, to set the scene and to set these standards, and this could be linked to the Binding Treaty campaign. This is the first. And the second is, I still think it would be a very good idea and opportunity to tackle Article 206 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, within the European Union, because its wording is just not attractive. The goal is eliminating barriers to trade. And we could, in the meaning of a coin with two sides, propose, look, this is the current wording. What if trade was at the service of human rights, labor rights, climate protection, biodiversity? This would be the backside of the coin, the new wording, and this might be an attractive campaign. And to that campaign, with a very easy message, we could link many of our other issues related to trade.
Thank you, Christian. Rachmi and then Monica. Okay.
No, yeah, just to share our reflections from the theme that we have discussed. Yeah, actually, the issue of what progressive trade agenda from the perspective of the South, I think the idea of decolonized trade, it should be the main idea of the progressive trade agenda for our work. And I think we also agreed that how to decolonize trade, I think we try to reflect what Melinda have present about the peace clause that could be possible. We try as the first step how to ensure that the global South has more spaces to develop or to use that kind of space to more have policy space, yeah, to create or to more benefit for our country. And the other issue is about how the idea of consumptions, yeah. So we agreed on how to use that kind of, how to limit the consumptions itself should be on the table. I think what Florence said about the re-territorializations of value chains, it should be put on the test on how we would like to create the fair of the trade agenda for our world, that's sustainable, that also put people's rights as the top priority of this agenda. Mm-hmm. I think that's from our side.
Awesome, thank you. Monica.
Thank you for your inputs. I would like to highlight a different question, because from our point of view, there are a lot of good ideas on alternative, but when it comes to climate catastrophe, we are running out of time. And yesterday in our workshop on climate and trade, we heard that 20 to 30% of worldwide emissions belong to CO2 emissions belong to trade, and we should talk about how we can manage it in reality to come down with the CO2 emissions. And several days ago I looked on a chart on the estimation when CO2 emissions should go steeply down, and it was a chart out of 2018, and then I recognized that the chart draw the picture that in 2023, so now, the curves should go steep down, but we are not yet there. So I would like to highlight that question that is, from my point of view, the underlying one of all our topics we are discussing here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Monica. I have now two more left. That is Joachim briefly, and then Florence, and then everybody who has indicated. Yeah, please.
I mean, I was reminded a bit about the debates of the 1970s, new international economic order, and changing the fora of decision-making to UNCTAD, and disempowering GATT in order to get rid of the old rules. Obviously, there is a need to get rid of old rules again. And it's a need for new international order, economic order, but economic, ecological orders. That's very different from in that regard, very different from the 1970s. And I think in order to have something overarching, that might be something like a direction. And I mean, what was quite visible on the panel, there are positive steps, but there is an extreme fragmentation of agreements, old agreements, new agreements, and partially in contradictions, and also in order to overcome that.
Thank you. Florence, in the first row.
Thank you. So I'll be very quick. We started with restating a general concern about inequalities and how various issues will unfold in terms of inequalities. And then the practical idea is in line a bit with the re-territorialization, but also inspired by the story you told, and the idea that life is actually occurs in the territories or at the local level. And so the proposal would be how to prioritize local circumstances in how social environmental rights are being preserved, in the general agreements. So go back to the local situations to assess, but I guess that would be a case by case maybe approach, but at least the general principle could give back power to where the stakes are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I am really sorry I have now to stick to finish, because because Penny needs to leave soon, and and lunch, of course, as well. But so thank you very much to you here on the panel, and thank you all very much now for adding on these ideas. I think there is important ideas that we have been sharing, reflections that we have been sharing. It's clear that we are now here not having any more the time to deepen this discussion, but I think that's us to take these ideas back to our organizations, to our networks, and also to the next spaces which we will have. I think one next space will be for those who will go to Brussels, 17th, 18th of July. There is the summit of heads of states of EU and Latin America, where some of the movements will meet and also have strategy discussions. I think we can take some of these ideas. We will have to continue this debate. We have to continue our campaigns. And I think it was really inspiring 2 days, 3 days actually, of sharing analysis, of sharing ideas, of talking to each other. And I just can say thank you to you all, thank you to you all. A big applause to all of us for this fantastic 2-3 days. And I just have now the honor to give back the micro to Werner, who will say the concluding words.
Okay, so thanks a lot to all the panelists of today's panel. Thanks a lot to all the panelists of yesterday and on Friday evening. I have basically just 2 things to do now. First, I'd like to extend words of thanks also to our organizing team. And secondly, give you... If you allow me for 1 minute, I'd like to read the names of the organizing team, so that you also perhaps get at least a couple of faces. So we had a big organizing team actually who made this whole event possible. It was, and I start with Claudia Bindt, who's with the EPSU team. She was responsible for catering and room management, together with Teresa, Lawrence, and Philip, who are partially at least with us. So give up, please, a hand of applause to Claudia Bindt and her team. We'd had Ingrid Bumpler, who's given a lot of general administrative support and also communications and accommodation. So Ingrid, I think, is somewhere in the room, back there. So Ingrid, thanks a lot. To my right-hand side, Florian Bittner, who's been giving technical support for all the 3 days. So Florian, thanks a lot. Clemens Lobnik, he has been our communications officer. He's done a lot of the press work, video work. He's not with us today, but nevertheless, he's also been very actively involved in all of that. We've had an organizing team that was taking charge of the registration, also taking charge of the conference rooms. And that has been 5 colleagues, Max, Aaron, Letizia, Valerie, and Leonhard. They are still with us, sitting here. Thanks a lot. And the colleagues from Medienwerk have been taking charge of all the live streams that we've produced over the... And finally, last but not least, I'd like to extend a great words of thank you to our conference coordinator, Teresa Kofler. Teresa, please. Okay, so before we go and invite you for a final lunch, for having a bite and the last glass of water or wine or coffee or whatever you would like, and a couple of last conversations, just let me give you an idea of the follow-up process to the conference. So obviously we'd like to make available to all of you the videos of all the panels that we've had. We've also made some interviews with some of the panelists that we will publish. And will be made available to all of you. We are still discussing in the organizing committee publications that will come out of the conference. So we're discussing something like a collected volume that will be published at an international publishing house. We're discussing a brochure that will be published by the conference organizers. We will keep you informed about all of that, and we'll make those informations accessible to you also, because it is important that there's some kind of follow-up process, dissemination of our discussions, summaries, etc. And finally, if you have not yet sent us your presentations or papers, please do so. I've been asked by many conference participants if the presentations in the workshops can be made accessible to all, so please, if you have not done so, please send us your presentations and papers so that we can disseminate them amongst us. Okay, so I hope you had 2 enjoyable days in Vienna. I hope you liked the exchanges. I hope you take a couple of good ideas home with you that might inspire your future work. We will certainly see each other in the future and cooperate. It has been a pleasure to welcome you all here in Vienna. Thanks again for coming and have a safe trip home. Thank you.